My husband placed a divorce packet on my lap 11 minutes after his father's burial, the ink still wet while condolences still hummed. He'd just been told he would receive $210 million, and I was supposed to vanish like his grief, quiet and unaccounted. You're watching Revenge Files. Subscribe for a new twist daily. The cemetery in Point Loma smelled like cut grass and salt. The gulls watched us the way gulls watch everything, without sympathy, waiting for whatever drops. I kept my hand on the black ribbon of my hat and tried to breathe through the whispering and the awkward handshakes and the way everyone said Richard was a giant, like we were in a book written for men who built towers and yachts. Evan let go of my elbow as soon as the last shovel of earth thudded. He walked to the rental black SUV, opened the back, and came back with a cream folder. No flowers, no hug. He didn't meet my eyes when he set it on my lap. "It's time," he said, a line he'd used when we bought our house, when we adopted our dog, when we signed for the hybrid. His voice carried the same confident brightness, except the folder didn't hold a new start. Inside, a petition filed in San Diego Superior Court, Family Law Division, stamped 2 days earlier at 9:41 a.m. He'd filed as petitioner and named me as respondent. The first page announced our marriage date, June 8, 2015, and irreconcilable differences. The last page said what he really meant. Separate property includes inheritance. I forced my thumb to stop shaking long enough to flip one more page. There was a proposed interim support of $0 and a suggestion that we each pay our own fees. One problem, he had just acquired generational money. On the limousine ride back to his mother's house in La Jolla, his phone buzzed with congratulations. His father's lawyer, a crisp man named Patterson with a sand-colored suit, had gathered the family in a teak-paneled room before the burial and described the trust distribution like a weather report. Evan would receive a controlling interest in Vail equities and a personal distribution wired in 2 tranches. $110 million by Friday, $100 million after the estate's final accounting. The numbers were as clinical as a pulse. I stared out the window at bougainvillea climbing a stucco wall and counted my breaths. I'd read enough articles to know inheritance is usually separate property in California. Usually is not always. Usually stops applying when promises grow roots, and when separate becomes commingled, and when someone puts their fortune into the mix and asks you to build something with it. But then I remembered what Evan had slipped in with the divorce papers, a mutual general release, the legal version of Don't Fight Me. He had a plan. He moved funds immediately. I watched it happen without seeing the screens. His posture changed the way a surfer leans into a bigger wave. The trust lawyer's people had set up a Delaware structure for him. Oak Lantern Holdings, one of those names that pretend to be trees and light, and I knew how fast money can sprint when everyone opens doors. I knew because I had opened doors with him for years. We met at the Hotel del Coronado while I was consulting for a boutique brand migrating their playbook to a new coastal property. He was charming in the way money makes men charming, a man who took off his sunglasses to talk to a waiter and remembered the busser's name. I built brand systems for small hospitality groups. He made debt feel like an art. We fit. Over 9 years, I wrote copy for websites, designed menus, shot photos at sunrise, and pitched social strategies to partners twice my age. When we launched Veil and Salt, the boutique arm he dreamed up to impress his father, I wrote the tagline and registered the trademark. He paid me sometimes and said he'd make me whole later more often. I turned the cream folder over. The ring on my finger nicked the edge of the cardstock. "Now?" I asked quietly. "Now, after we buried him?" His jaw did that little fake sorrow quiver. "It's cleaner. Cleaner is how you describe a countertop. Cleaner is not how you end a life together." But then the funeral guests started arriving at the house and someone pressed a glass of Pellegrino into my hand, and I realized he chose the 1 hour of my life with the least mobility and the most eyes. He wanted me still and mute. I excused myself to the upstairs bedroom that had become our room when Richard got sick and we moved in for months at a time. I shut the door and opened the nightstand drawer where I keep receipts for things I want to remember. There, carefully folded under a photo strip from a fair, was a 1-page letter we'd signed at a UPS store on El Cajon Boulevard on August 17, 2021, the day after we finished couples counseling, and promised we'd stop letting money talk for us. The paper was not a full-dress postnuptial agreement. It was simple. We agree that any future legacy that builds property, business, or housing for our family shall be treated and titled jointly. It had our signatures and a notary stamp slightly crooked like a smile. Not perfect, but not nothing. I took a photo of the notarized page and texted it to myself, to my sister in Oregon, and to an email address I use for contracts with the subject line, "Proof of joint treatment, signed." Then I typed another note on my phone, "Automatic temporary restraining orders." I knew enough to know that when a divorce is filed in California, the summons carries rules, the outros, that forbid the parties from transferring, encumbering, or concealing property outside the ordinary course of business. The ink on Evan's petition was barely dry, and he was about to receive $110 million in 4 days. Ordinary course doesn't include moving mountains. I left the bedroom and rejoined the warmth of casseroles and quiet gossip. I smiled with my mouth and not my eyes. I thanked a cousin for the flowers and kissed Richard's sister on both cheeks. I watched Evan shake hands with a banker from his father's circle, and I memorized the name on the card the banker slid into Evan's palm. I'm quiet when I hunt. I always have been. By 6 a.m. the next morning, I was in the lobby of a glass building in Mission Valley with a folder of our life. I'd texted 3 lawyers the night before while everyone else was washing Crystal in the kitchen. 2 replied overnight with consultation available this week. 1 replied at 11:13 p.m. 8:30 a.m. works if you can be here early. Her name was Alicia Mercado. Her online reviews said she doesn't flinch. Alicia wore a charcoal blazer and a ponytail that said she could run a marathon in court shoes. She listened while I laid out 9 years, the brand decks, the invoices that were paid, the ones that weren't, the ways Vail and Salt had blurred into Vail equities until you couldn't tell where my sweat ended and their capital began. When I showed her the August 2021 UPS letter, she didn't smile. She set it on the table and lined it with the edge of her legal pad like it was a blade. "It's not bulletproof," she said, "but it's a writing, signed by both of you, describing joint treatment. If he used inherited money to acquire or improve assets held jointly under this," she tapped the page with a fingernail that caught the light, "he has a problem." "He wired 2 tranches," I said. "First one hits Friday." Alicia's eyes went to the clock like she could see a fuse. "Then we move before lunch. Retainer is $8,200. My rate is $425. My associate is $275. We'll need a forensic for the business side. Budget $6,000 to start. Today, we file our response and our own request for orders. We ask the court to restrain extraordinary transfers. We request temporary support, and we give notice to the trustee. If he moves money despite the summons, the judge can pull him over by the year." I signed. I initialed. I paid the retainer with a credit card that was half mine and half his by a promise made over pancakes. But then Alicia said, "You have anything else in writing?" And I remembered something I had buried under hurt. 2 summers ago, after Richard's second hospitalization, Evan had emailed me a photo of a yellow legal pad page torn from his father's desk. In his tight engineer handwriting, Richard had written, "If Evan receives an early distribution for boutique expansion, he must have spouse's consent if spouse contributed materially to brand." It wasn't a formal clause. It read like a policy note a man writes to tame chaos. Evan had replied to me with a heart emoji and the words, "Dad knows." I'd saved it because I wanted to believe families could be decent. I searched my Gmail and there it was, Dad's note. "We're in this." I slid my phone across the table. Alicia read it twice. "Not law," she said, "but leverage. Trustees hate noise. If the trustee sees this and you send notice that you contributed materially, they may pause distributions until they verify their procedures. He'll hate that." At 11:06 a.m., Alicia filed our response and a request for order with exhibits, the UPS letter, my invoices, the Gmail thread, photos of the brand collateral we built in our kitchen with markers and takeout. She filed a proposed order that quoted the summons language back to the court and asked the clerk to set a hearing within 10 days. She also drafted a letter to Breckenridge Trust Company in Denver, the entity handling Richard's estate, notifying them that I claimed a material contribution and that precipitous distributions could prejudice community or jointly treated property. She CC'd Patterson, the sand-colored lawyer. I left Alicia's office and drove to La Jolla with the radio off. The ocean looked like steel, all edges and cold. The front door beeped when I opened it. Evan's voice floated from the kitchen. "There she is," he said to someone who laughed. On the Marble Island lay papers with the name Oak Lantern Holdings, LLC, and a stack of wire instructions, with numbers I knew I couldn't lift without burning my palms. He ended the call when he saw me. "This is ugly, Claire. You don't want to do ugly." "I don't want to do anything," I said softly. "But you set the table." I took the dog's leash from the hook by the door and opened the small mudroom cabinet where we keep useful junk, a tape measure, a level, the common screws of a house. I pulled the tape measure and ran it along the entry table we'd bought at a flea market in 2016. The measure clicked at 38 inches. I wrote it on a sticky note and stuck it under the table. That is how I stay calm. I measure things. Later, looking at a judge, I could say, I measured the table the day I was served. Judges like details that don't scream. A courier arrived at 2:23 p.m. with Alicia's filed papers in a packet stamped with a hearing date, March 28th at 9 a.m. The summons atros glowed in generous font. I slid one copy under Evan's study door and kept one for the refrigerator. He read it standing in the doorway with that face he wears when a server tells him they're out of halibut. "You're overplaying a bad hand," he said. Except I wasn't the one bluffing about the rules. At 8:12 the next morning, Alicia called. Patterson responded, she said. "They assert inheritance is separate property. They say your UPS letter is meaningless. They also said the Friday wire to Oak Lantern will go forward as planned." "They put that in writing?" "In writing," she said. So I walked our papers to the ex parte window for emergency relief. Judge Whitaker signed a temporary restraining order at 8:57 a.m., enjoining any transfer out of the ordinary course, pending the March 28th hearing. I served Breckenridge. The Trustees' Council replied at 9:21. "We have paused Friday's distribution until we review." I closed my eyes and let my head rest against the kitchen cabinet. The dog nosed my shin, confused by new air. The tide had not turned, but it had stopped racing out. That afternoon, I opened a banker's box in our garage labeled V&S Early Days. Inside were sketches of logos, menus annotated with my notes, and a printed draft of the operating agreement for Vale and Salt Hospitality, LLC, dated April 3rd, 2019. On page 8, a clause read, "Goodwill, trade dress, and marks contributed by Claire Vale shall be treated as capital contributions valued at $150,000 for purposes of distributions." It bore both our signatures. He had loved making me feel like a partner when we were poor. I copied the clause and texted it to Alicia. She replied with a thumbs up and a sentence, "That language ties revenue to you. We can ask for an accounting." But then a courier delivered something uglier, a letter from a firm in Beverly Hills with a reputation for high polish and higher bills, stating that I had emotional difficulties and warning that allegations interfering with trust distributions may expose you to liability. They offered a walkaway, a check for $250,000, and mutual non-disparagement. It was the legal version of a smirk. I took the letter to my quiet place, the back steps where the yard drops toward the canyon and pepper trees flick their sleeves in the breeze. I read it 3 times, and then I did something small that felt like a drumbeat. I opened my laptop, logged into the California Secretary of State portal, and filed a UCC-1 financing statement listing my interest in the Goodwill, trade dress, and marks of Vale and Salt Hospitality, LLC, describing the April 3rd, 2019 clause. It cost $15. I hit submit. A few hours later, I received a confirmation number. It was not an armored car. It was a nail. I also did what women do when men try to move them out of their own lives. I documented. I photographed the furniture and the art. I scanned the pet adoption papers and the vet bills. I inventoried the kitchen by drawer and the garage by shelf. I collected 12 emails in which Evan used "are" to describe our portfolio, our boutique arm, our equity, words that Don Draper taught a generation to use like sugar. I saved everything twice. A week later, Evan tried to change the locks. He did it at 7 p.m., a petty hour. I called Alicia, and she told me to call for a civil standby. A San Diego police officer arrived and stood with arms folded while I showed him the restraining order and the fact that I still lived here. The officer told Evan he couldn't lock me out without a court order, and the locks went back the way they were. It wasn't high drama. It was paperwork and patience. It was me refusing to vanish. Then came March 28th. Family court in downtown San Diego feels like a high school built with less hope. The hallways carry every kind of grief. Alicia sat beside me at counsel table with a binder that looked like it could level a table. Evan sat across with two lawyers, Beverly Hills and local, whispering into his ear like stage directions. Judge Whitaker had iron gray hair and read everything. He asked Alicia to summarize. She did without heat, pointing to our exhibits, the UPS letter, the April 2019 operating agreement, my invoices, the Gmail thread with Richard's note, the UCC filing confirmation, and the Beverly Hills letter offering hush money. Petitioner has received or stands to receive a $210 million trust distribution, Alicia said. Respondent contributed materially to a business that, per a signed operating agreement, values her contributions at $150,000 for distribution purposes. She also entered a signed, notarized writing with petitioner in August 2021 describing joint treatment of legacy when it built housing or business for the family. Petitioner filed this action 2 days before his father's burial and attempted to transfer funds in violation of the summons automatic restraining orders. We ask that the temporary orders restraining extraordinary transfers be extended. We seek temporary support of $29,500 per month, retroactive to filing, an advance on fees of $75,000, and an order for an accounting of veil and salt. Patterson's local co-counsel rose and made a point of sighing. Inheritance is separate property, he said. The August letter is vague. The operating agreement was between spouses and is easily revocable. We ask the court to lift restraints so the trustee can distribute as intended. Judge Whitaker looked at Evan. When did you sign the summons? 2 days before the funeral, Evan said. And when did you instruct the trustee to transfer funds to Oak Lantern? Evan tried on a confused face. It's all on autopilot. Nothing about $110 million is autopilot, the judge said flatly. He turned to Alicia. The August writing is not a model, but it's a writing. The operating agreement is not a fortune, but it's a promise. The summons restrains behavior like petitioners. The court orders as follows. Temporary restraining orders on non-ordinary transfers remain in place pending further order. Petitioner shall pay respondent temporary support of $29,500 per month, beginning April 1st. Petitioner shall advance respondent's attorney's fees in the amount of $75,000 within 10 days. Parties shall exchange complete preliminary declarations of disclosure within 20 days. An accounting of Veil and Salt Hospitality, LLC, for the period January 1st, 2019 to present shall be produced within 30 days. The gavel didn't fall because gavels don't fall in rooms like this. The words fell instead, and they made a sound I'd been waiting to hear since the morning I watched him set a folder on my lap. He glared at me in the hallway like I had stolen a yacht. "You're choking my business," he said. "You tried to erase my life," I said, and walked past him into air that smelled like a food truck and diesel. But then the mid-roll surge arrived like a rip current. The trustees' council emailed Alicia a week later. "We have identified a discrepancy in our file. An early distribution of $12 million was made last summer to Vail and Salt Beach Holdings for the purchase of the Laguna property. Our file includes a consent letter from a spouse, illegible, authorizing that distribution for boutique expansion. We request confirmation." I remembered that summer. Evan had shoved a clipboard at me on the way to a tasting and said, "Sign here so we can keep escrow on schedule." I'd signed on the porch with sunscreen in my eyes. I'd thought it was a FedEx delivery. Alicia asked the trustee for a PDF. They sent it. The signature block read spouse, and my signature slanted across it with a flourish I use when I'm happy. The text above it said, "Pursuant to internal policy requiring spouse consent for early distributions, when spouse materially contributes to boutique operations, we consent to the $12 million distribution to Vail and Salt Beach Holdings for Laguna acquisition." That wasn't statutory power, that was family governance. And still, it was a string tied to the trunk of a very large tree. Alicia folded the PDF into our leverage package like a queen of spades. "This is not a court order," she said, "but it is a trustee policy that was honored last summer. If they ignored their own policy now, they could face their own problems, which means Evan will have to negotiate with us, not over us." Negotiation is mostly boredom, punctuated by heat. Evan's lawyers proposed a buyout that sounded like a tip, $1.2 million and the Prius. Alicia countered with a demand grounded in numbers, a lump sum of $22 million, reflecting my share of the increased value attributable to my contributions to Vail and Salt, a 35% interest in the Laguna Holding Company until a sale or refinance, the La Jolla house titled solely to me, temporary support continuing for 12 months, and fees of $200,000. We backed it with a forensic accountant's preliminary report. May Tran, CPA, had spent 2 weeks with the books. Her spreadsheet traced how my brand systems and contracts corresponded with revenue spikes. She put the marital contribution to increased value at $43.2 million. We asked for half of that plus the house. It wasn't charity. It was a bill. He scoffed. He tried charm by text. "We don't have to be enemies," he wrote. "Take something fair. Don't set me on fire in front of my board." He tried threat through counsel. "Your UCC1 is overreaching and will be challenged." He tried fatigue, dragging discovery until I thought I'd drown in PDFs. Then he tried spectacle. He invited friends to a fundraiser and posed with a check in a suit that made him look like the district attorney of a county where no one wears socks. He wanted the story to be how generous he was. I kept showing up. I took notes in pencil. I highlighted dates. I made coffee for Alicia's paralegal when she stayed late to bind exhibits. I learned the court's rhythms, which elevators run slow, which rooms run fast, which clerks like pleasantries, and which like silence. I learned to breathe through depositions. When they asked if I really contributed to a brand because isn't brand ephemeral, I smiled and said, ephemeral is why people pay for it. When they asked why I cared about the Laguna property, I said, because I signed to get it purchased. I asked for a 10-minute break when my hand started to tremble and washed my face in a bathroom that smelled like toothpaste and fear. Then, at a mandatory settlement conference in late June, the judge assigned to mediate, a man with kind eyes and a reputation for moving mountain goats, closed the door and told both sides to sit. He spoke for 3 minutes about decency. Then he turned to Evan's counsel. "You're not going to win by pretending she didn't exist. The trustee's pause is not a weapon she created. It's a pause you earned by ignoring your own note. If you want distributions to resume, get right with your house." Evan stared at the tabletop and pressed his lips into a line that looked like the equal sign on a calculator. He excused himself to make a call. And when he returned, his lawyer said, "We can talk in real numbers." Real numbers arrived after lunch. The marital settlement agreement came together like a bridge built from both ends. He would transfer to me $18.4 million within 30 days of signing, $10 million immediate, $8.4 million within 30 days after closing a credit line. He would deed me the La Jolla house within 10 days, free of liens. He would assign me 30% of Vail and Salt Beach Holdings until sale or refinance, with a minimum payout of $3.6 million upon any triggering event within 3 years. Temporary support would continue for 12 months at $29,500 per month. He would pay $192,000 toward my fees within 15 days. In return, I would withdraw the UCC1 after receiving the lump sum, sign a limited release tailored to the agreed assets, and notify the trustee that I no longer objected to distributions, consistent with the policy that required my consent for early boutique-related transfers. We added a simple non-disparagement clause with one clear exception. Either party could tell the truth in legal proceedings or to law enforcement. The agreement included timelines like checklists: 10 days, 15, 30. I like checklists. They keep men honest. We signed on July 2nd in a conference room with ugly carpet. The mediator watched our pens move and then initialed each page. Alicia hugged me in the hallway and said, "It's not everything, but it's enough." I believed her because my hand stopped shaking for the first time since the graveside dirt went dark. The first wire hit my account by 3:22 p.m. The bank called to verify, and I answered each security question with a precision that felt like prayer. I drove home slowly, parked in the driveway, and sat for a minute with my forehead against the steering wheel. The house was mine the way ocean is coastline, not because of a deed alone, but because of how long waves carved the same stone. At 6:40 the next morning, I walked the dog past the post office where we'd notarized our August 2021 page. The woman who'd notarized us, Linda, with the cat pin, was working the counter. She didn't remember me. She handed a kid a passport application and joked about summer. The world did not tilt. It almost annoyed me that it didn't tilt. My life had cracked open and the mail still moved. Later that week, the trustee resumed distributions. The estate sent a polite note: "Thank you for your cooperation. Per internal policy, we will continue to require spouse consent only for boutique-related early distributions." I forwarded it to Alicia with a single line, string cut. By August 15th, the deed had recorded. The title report listed my name first and only. The county's website refreshed on a Thursday at 2:07 p.m., and I took a screenshot that I texted to my sister with too many exclamation points. "You did that," she wrote back. "You turned a folder into a foundation." But then a last ripple arrived. A reporter from a local business journal emailed to ask for comment on the Vale family's boutique expansion and family transition. The old me would have written a quote that made everyone sound generous. The new me wrote, "No comment," and put my phone in a drawer. Silence is what men think they give women to punish them. It can also be a gift you give yourself, wrapped in your own ribbon. I used some of the money to rebuild my practice on my terms. I kept 3 clients and told 6 no. I bought equipment I used to rent. I sent Alicia a thank you note with a hand-drawn lemon on the front and a paragraph inside that said what I mean. Not just thank you for the orders and the totals and the transfers, but thank you for reminding me what I can do with my hands when I refuse to be erased. On a Sunday in September, I drove up to Laguna and stood in the lobby of the property that nearly slipped past me in a stack of papers. The bartender was polishing glassware with a towel that left no lint. A couple took a selfie in the soft light. I stood off to the side and let myself watch what we had built. My share would vest when the refinance closed. The email said, likely before Thanksgiving. I didn't need the calendar to turn to feel finished. Back in La Jolla, I took the tape measure from the mudroom and pulled it across the entry table again. 38 inches, just like March. The number steadied me in a way that had nothing to do with wood. It steadied me because it reminded me of the morning I chose to live in detail, not in fear. Because it reminded me that when a man tried to make my presence temporary, I made my evidence permanent. The night we buried Richard, gulls waited for something to fall. Today, nothing fell. I measured, I cited, I filed, I signed, I walked into rooms that were not designed for me, and I stood there until someone wrote it down. I didn't vanish after grief. I did the opposite.